Hey, what's up everybody? Rob Marzullo here, Ram Studio Comics. Welcome back. So today's video, I want to go through some basic, fundamental kind of drawing principles. So the very beginning, uh, a lot of times on this channel, I go right to maybe trying to draw some anatomy or figure drawing or things like that. And I think sometimes I pass up what some of the beginning artists might need to hear about. We get to an extent where we've drawn for so long we forget to really cover the basics. So we're gonna start with some basics. I'll get into stuff that's a little bit more advanced, but probably intermediate at best on this one. So if you're a more advanced artist, this probably isn't the greatest lesson for you, but maybe you'll still pick something up from it. I don't know. So at any rate, what I want to show you is that something that's helpful to do if you really just can't seem to get things going in a dimensional state of mind and draw in perspective and things like that is really just going back to basics. So you've probably heard a lot of artists say things like that, go back to basics and really get back to primitive shapes. And that's what I'm doing here. So I'm just drawing obviously a sphere and a cube, and putting a plane back here. It could be the edge of a table or something like that. And the benefit of doing these types of studies is it's very simplistic, but it's still all the same information that you're going to get if you go to draw something elaborate like figure drawing or a dimensional a perspective with lots of details. It's all the same basic information. You just have to interpret it and put lots of things on top of things, essentially. So for instance, if you were to take this cube and you were to draw back visually like this until all these lines converge, however long that takes, somewhere back here is going to be your vanishing point. That's just a basic rule of perspective. And that same thing applies even to the sphere. If you were to try to get the shadow of it, you would use that perspective to even draw out the shadow. So, and likewise, the shadow here, you would draw through it. Now, based on the positioning of the light source, that's not going to line up with the vanishing point, of course. But you would use the light source as the vanishing point. So you might have the vanishing point converge over here, call VP, and then light source over here. But you could still use perspective to find your light source, is what I'm getting at. So these are just basic rules of drawing, and they can be applied to very primitive shapes like this. So that's one thing I want to show you. And again, if you find yourself struggling to get more elaborate, detailed things, including your shading, everything really, start with these basic primitives. Get an idea going for how this stuff works and how you want to see it. Like I think the shadow would go there. I'm actually struggling to see that. It's either there or, I guess based on where the light source is, the shadow could be like this as well. And then you could have bounce light, so you get this little shaded area down here. Whatever. We're not going to get into too much overall of each one, because this video would just be huge. But, you want to practice even your basic shading on these primitives is what I'm getting at. So that you're really trying to give this depth to this scene, even with just something as simple as a sphere and a cube. So it's a great exercise. Not something you should probably spend too much time on, unless you just have lots of time on your hands. So the next one, what I wanted to talk about, a lot of people kind of stress that they struggle with anatomy and figure drawing, and again, that's a whole nother monster that's way more complex than what we're talking about here, but I do want to show you how it translates. So for instance, one of the things I always tell people if they're struggling with making an arm come out towards camera, and I won't have it directly towards camera because I want to show you kind of how I use these cylinders to visually make an arm come out towards camera, right? So I take these cylinders and I overlap them. And forgive me if you can hear my son rambling about the house there. This mic pretty much picks up everything. So if I was to take a sphere here, a cylinder here, a cylinder here, these are very basic primitive shapes, and to me this is an arm. I don't know if you could see it yet, but it's starting to happen. Now I can take a hand and I could do this wedge shape off right here and put a hand right there. Now I probably wouldn't put the hand as straight as that with the forearm. So that's another thing that starts to happen as you draw more and more of this. You start to think, well, no, really the hand would probably tilt and it'd probably come out this way. So you start to realize the pivots kind of that all the body takes. And that comes with time and lots of figure drawing studies and lots of just creating your own artwork and learning to make little changes till you start seeing things that might look a little better, and it's a progressive kind of thing. And it's not something that happens overnight, so don't stress yourself out with that. The main thing is that you study the ability to construct things with these primitive shapes, because it makes it a lot easier to work up to it. So for instance, if I was to take this, let me just make sure it's on a separate layer. And I'm not going to talk about working with digital tools here. I'm trying to keep this as basic as something that could work digital or traditional. So this can all be done with pencil and paper. So now if I was to take it from this primitive shape and soft erase it down, I can start to figure out where I would maybe overlay some anatomy. And just keep in mind, if you're not really sure where the anatomy goes, maybe start off with just studying the silhouette. You know, so do something like this where it's not as detailed of anatomy, which I think a lot of artists, myself included, we want to like detail the anatomy way too much anyways, and we go way too heavy into it way too early on. So just get a few of those basic shapes in there and call that an arm and a hand. Don't try to get every single tendon, muscle, vein, you know, especially if you're still learning. But just pay attention to certain things, you know, things like the fingers have these slight little segments, and those can be drawn just with some little stick figure lines like that. There's webbing to the thumb connecting to the hand, whatever. You know, I'm not going to get too far into detail because I don't want this to be some complex thing as much as I want to show you that this is the process to work up to this stuff. And then when you get to the part where you start laying in your anatomy and your outer lying structure, I guess, or whatever, you're going to just study that from life. You're going to study that from photos. You're going to study it from artists that you like and art styles that you like. And you're going to work up to that over top of what you see here. But if you kind of build it up with this really basic rudimentary process, it becomes a lot easier. Now the other thing that I want to show you is that if you were to take the same arm pose, this is a little bit more of a foreshortened pose, and it can seem a bit complex at first, even though it's really not anything different, and that's why I want to show you these basic shapes. But if you start with any of this stuff from a side view, or a top view or whatever. Actually, let's do a top view. It can sometimes alleviate some of the stress of it. So let's say that we're trying to perceive this in a top view. So you see there's a slight, it's angles down to here. It probably shifts angles right to about there, something like that. Obviously at the elbow and that. So let's perceive that it comes back this way. It looks like it goes past the shoulder a bit. So let's show that in our illustration here. So it should go past the shoulder, you know, roundabout. I mean, it doesn't have to be perfect, but we just want to show the angles. The hand goes back the other way, you know, kind of lines up with the shoulder at least from this perspective. So something like this. So what I want to do is, again, take those basic primitive shapes. And I like to usually start a bit thinner with the shapes than all the anatomy and all the overlay stuff, because I feel if I start too large with them, I kind of get what I got here. This kind of bulkiness that looks a little too thick at parts of the arm and hand, even though that's not the greatest sketch. But let's go ahead and start thin with these pieces here. You know, let's go ahead and do the same thing. Put some fingers on the end. Just you can usually start with just a couple segments, even though we know there's 3. You'll see a lot of artists draw 2 at first, and then just kind of figure out where that third one would bend. And again, you want to study hands and see how they react. The fingers react a certain way, and the alignment of the knuckles or something like this. So little things like that. And so now if you draw it in an easier perspective like this, you can almost use this as a visual aid to do this over here. So that's really all I want to show you there. I don't want to get too far into each one of these and try to start teaching anatomy or anything like that. But I want you to, again, learn to simplify your work. Don't beat yourself up over it. Don't get too clustered or mentally frustrated with trying to do too much too soon. And here's the best way to improve upon your work, I think. And we're all very different creatively, and we're very different creatures when it comes to creating our art. But you just learn by repetition, and you learn by your studies. And I would say study more. If you feel yourself like really hitting a wall, study more. Don't just go right to drawing. Drawing is studying. It's committing it to memory. But really look at the picture. Really study the underlying structure of things. Really study the balance, the weight, the posture of the body. Try to look past the surface. And I know it sounds a bit silly and like, not the easiest thing to do, but that's really what separates kind of accomplished artists from beginners. Lots of things, but that's I think that's a primary thing. So really look to learn what's under the surface. Like for instance, if we were to draw a body, just real quick, if I draw a body and I draw them, I don't know, if I see a drawing of a body and they're kind of like this, I'll do usually like the rib cage, the pelvis, the legs. The legs usually kind of bend out and they bend back like this. The feet, hands on the hips, something like that. Okay, so that's a basic pose, pretty plain Jane, right? And the first thing I think now, after trying to study a lot of these and drawing, I've drawn, I don't know, thousands of poses in my life or whatever, I start to think about how I can make that look more believable, even at this little basic sketch. So if I take this, scale it down, get it out of the way here, I'll try to keep as much of these sketches on the page just to make it easier to see what I'm doing here. So if I try to make that a little bit more believable and expressive, the first thing I think about, and some people will draw the head lash, just so you know, is to get a little bit of bend to that spine. Hardly anybody stands straight up. I mean, this is kind of a posture where they probably would, but let's just try to make that look a little bit more expressive and keep everything else the same. Let's think about once the body, a little tilt to the upper abdomen from the direction of the face. So always try to have each one of these pointing a little bit different way, even if only slightly. And then let's say we'll still have the hands on the hips, but let's have one arm, now that the abdomen, upper body is tilted, let's have one just hidden just a little bit and one more out visibly, like it would be, like that. And then let's try to, I don't know, weight the legs just a little bit, or posture to one side or the other. So if the spine's kind of tilting like this, let's just say, I think it could go either way, but let's say that he's standing more, the weight is more on this leg. Let's try that. And then this one's just kind of off to the side a bit. And I don't know if this is entirely correct. I'm not looking at any reference here, but I try to draw as much from the mind as I can, and then if I can't get something right, I'll study reference for a bit, maybe do some figure drawing studies, and then come back to it. So I don't know that I conveyed that properly there. Hopefully I did, but essentially, to me, this is a little bit more interesting of a pose. So that it almost goes back to this example where I just try to turn things just a little bit. It doesn't have to be all dramatic. I think in the beginning, we try to take things and we go from this one right here, and we try to immediately go to something, way too dynamic. So say we got this character, I don't know, flying out towards camera, delivering that superhero punch or something like that, since that's typically what I draw as superheroes. So I'll just do something like that. And, there's nothing wrong with trying these types of poses, but you kind of have to work up to them. I'm not saying this is some perfect thing, but, generally kind of fake it and get it in place. And as bad as this may seem, this is kind of how I work up to this idea. And then it's just all about the finished work and the level of refinement that I put on it. But you don't really want to jump right to this type of pose. Like, this is something that you work up to and you learn from and study, and I'm still making mistakes here, but that's part of life. But you need to worry about the subtleties here first, I think, and then you need to worry about drawing the primitive shapes and getting a feel for making something look dimensional. And then when you get to this type of pose and you render it out, obviously make it look a lot better than that, it'll come out so much better because you did the homework, you did the foundational information. You did these studies. So I would say basically start with the primitive shapes. Do some figure drawing, that'll help you get an idea for how the body works. Look for weight, look for posture, balance, things like that. Also, practice drawing basic poses like this and then turning them visually in your mind or on the page, but use your mind to obviously picture them in different poses and do that as much as possible. So when you go to draw a head, for instance, draw your head shape, whatever it is, whatever your style is fine. We all have very different styles, but go with what you're comfortable with. Do as much construction work as you need to place all the features and things like that. More is better usually when it comes to alignment and construction of the underlying structure of the face, and then you're just going to build up over top of that. But then don't just get in the habit of drawing it here and then drawing it pointing to the side, for instance. Like, just trying to rough this out pretty quickly. That's okay. That's fine. These are probably the two most popular poses that you're going to do. But that's definitely what you shouldn't just stick with. Got this head the wrong shape. You want to do your angles. You got to do your angles. You got to tilt it ever so slightly. And you don't want to just tilt it to this degree. You want to practice. Get this one in place. So again, using the construction lines and kind of a quick, messy Andrew Loomis thing, but get that into place rather quickly. But you don't want to just do this angle. You want to put an angle where the nose and the eye is right at the very edge of the face. And this is actually, to me, this one's actually a little trickier. But that's how you really get good at this. And you also want to practice drawing your character the same way, or the same look, at all these different angles. That's really where it becomes tricky anyways, and that's where you learn the most, I think. So you want to really practice tilting these, and then one of the hardest ones is actually tilting the head up. And I think the tough part about this one is getting that chin to connect to the neck just right. So that takes a little bit of time to figure out. A lot of people struggle with that one, myself included. I always tell people, like, they always ask me questions about how to improve upon this, how to improve upon that. I always tell them, you're always improving, and I'm always improving. I'm nowhere near to some grander scale where I think I'm some great artist and I'm done improving. We're always improving every day, every day. And I'll tell you, if you stop improving and you just think you got there, then that's a sad day, I think. I think you need to just keep looking for new ways to improve and explore new ideas with your art and creativity, and keep working at it. So I'm going to leave you with that. This is a bit of a basic lesson, and I know I usually get a lot more in depth with stuff, and these are some pretty rough sketches, but hopefully this gives you an idea of how to work up to that stuff. So I always feel bad if I teach these figure drawing class and things like that, and then people go, yeah, but how do I get to where I'm ready for that? And so this is really the basic primitive approach that I take to studies and things like that, and hopefully that helps you. Also, just to keep you updated, I got some Skillshare classes now as well, and I'm adding new content to that. There'll be a link in the description box below if you're a Skillshare fan and you want to check those out. So as always, keep drawing, keep having fun, and I will talk to you soon.